Great. Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Feinstein. I use he, him pronouns. I'm in central Massachusetts on Nipmuc land. And I was a worker owner of a worker co-op, Future Focused Media Co-op, for 10 years and part of grassroots support organization in Worcester, Mass, called Worcester Roots for even longer than that. And this webinar is a 90-minute webinar. And we will, go with the flow of where you all want to take it. I have a lot of information to share, but happy to answer questions. So put them in the chat as they come up if they're relevant to the topic. Or we'll also have time at the end for questions and discussion. I've also put in the chat a links document that will have a lot of the resources I'll be mentioning, so you don't have to scramble and catch all the links and websites I'll be mentioning. A lot of those are in that links document. You can feel free to make a copy of that and take your notes in there and things like that. I am recording, so feel free to be on camera or off camera, but know that we'll be recording this and sending it as a resource. Yeah, feel free to chime in at any point with additional resources or other questions. And I'm just getting these linked documents to the people who are trickling in here. And yeah, feel free to share a little bit in the chat and then network in the chat if you'd like as well. I don't see anyone posting yet, but feel free to, post in the chat a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you're here for, and anything else, and then feel free to connect with others. Hi, Hannah and Keith. I'm glad you were able to make it short notice. Great. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Just passing this info along to newcomers. Great. So at the US Federation of Worker Co-ops, we have a program called Co-op Clinic, which is what this webinar is under. It's our education, training, and technical assistance program of the US Federation of Worker Co-ops. And the heart of it is our network of peer advisors, right? Folks who are out there to support people starting co-ops or turning businesses into co-ops, and that these advisors come from the experience of being in co-ops themselves and are now experts in governance, decision-making, conflict processes, bylaws. Some of them are finance experts and business plan gurus. So that, we have this network and we maintain all these great advisors from around the country with different language capacities and experiences in different things. And then we match up people who need those support services with one of these advisors. When there's a grant, we can help cover those technical assistance costs. Otherwise, it's a fee-for-service process. So if you're interested in a consultation to figure out if you're ready for that kind of support, feel free to go to usworker.coop/clinic. And again, that link is in the links document, but here it is in the chat. And you can feel free to go ahead and sign up, click the Get Support button, and you'll get an intake with our staff, and then we'll match you up if you're ready for a project. So if you're just arriving, you want to share a little bit about yourself in the chat, it'd be great to hear who's here. And feel free to network with each other and direct messages, etc. in the chat. All right, let's dive into it, right? There's a lot to get through about the worker co-op startup process. But first about co-ops in general, right? There's lots of different ways of organizing cooperatives, but we like to think about it as people coming together to buy together are consumer cooperatives, right? And that includes a whole kind of range of businesses like REI, the outdoors co-op, right? Where you become a member if you're a consumer there, and you might get a dividend check at the end of the year if you've purchased quite a bit from that co-op. Let's see, housing cooperatives could be considered consumer cooperatives too, right? You're using the housing, you own a collective house together, any surplus, you decide how to treat that as members. Or credit unions are kind of the, one of the most common ones you might see all around the country that are cooperative banks, right? And if you're a depositor there, you might be automatically a member. You have to sign up as a member to be a depositor at a credit union. Or electric co-ops, right? That there's so many different kinds of consumer co-ops. Then there's producer cooperatives, right? Where people have come together to sell or market together. These are common, especially in the agricultural sector, right? Where farmers come together to produce a common good. Cabot cheese or ocean spray cranberry, where it's not every person milking the cow or harvesting the cranberry that is an individual member of the co-op. It's the farms, right, who have come together as LLCs or different entities themselves that own the cooperative that does processing or marketing or selling together, right? Whereas in worker co-ops, it is the individual worker, member, owner of the workplace in all sorts of industries, right? In the agricultural industry as well, but many other industries. So we're focusing on worker co-ops today. There are also multi-stakeholder cooperatives that mix some of these, right? There could be a co-op marketplace, right? That like a natural food store, which are commonly consumer cooperatives, but they could be multi-stakeholder. The workers could be member owners as well and have a separate class of membership. So I'm happy to talk about the multi-stakeholder model too for people who are interested in that. It looks like there's a apparel cooperative present that is structured as multi-stakeholder. So we can go there too as well, but I'm going to focus on worker co-ops, which are the individual worker owners of a business. And again, we're in so many different industries, very common in service sector industries, right? And cleaning and home care, but many industrial, there are lots of industrial cooperatives and worker co-op farms and tech companies and lots of different industries are part of our membership. And co-ops come together to form, people come together to form co-ops for good work, fair pay, job security in the way that you are the member owner of your business, and to build community internally and to address needs in the community externally, right? Co-ops exist to meet a need in the community, whether it's, co-ops in general, like the electric service co-ops, people are not wanting, big companies are not wanting to do, provide electric service in your area. So people have come together to form their electric service co-ops. To worker co-ops, right? Where there's a need for job creation in a certain area, or you have a passion around a certain kind of business and you want to do that work. We have folks here that are doing sustainable ecological landscaping, right? And that's a passion work, but how do you form a business to do that sustainably and create a living out of it, right? That's why people come together for these worker co-ops. We envision a new kind of economy, but how do we build a foundational thing that can support our livelihood while doing that? And a thriving co-op embodies all of these eventually, but might be really strong in one area, right? We come together for the creation of good jobs, but eventually we want to really address these broader community concerns, etc. And in worker co-ops, or worker ownership in general, we think about it in two major components. The joint ownership, which has financial benefit, right? There's some joint risk and reward to becoming a member of a cooperative, right? You pay a fee to become a member usually, and then you have eligibility to share in the surplus profit. And then there's the democratic decision making. And decision-making power that's distributed to members of a cooperative. So in worker co-ops, you have both of these components, right? You have both the joint ownership and the democratic decision-making. There's plenty of businesses that have one or the other, or entities, right? There are employee stock ownership plans or other employee-owned companies that have that financial benefit, right? If you're an owner you know, are rewarded when there's an upside to the company. But they may not necessarily have the democratic decision making, right? Very few employee stock ownership plans or ESOPs or fully employee-owned companies also have the democratic decision-making power, unless they're worker co-ops. Then you have both. And then some entities have the democratic decision-making, um, and that they could be democratic workplaces, but not necessarily have the democratic uh, financials, right? The financial benefit or the joint ownership. This is namely worker self-directed nonprofits or other democratic workplace nonprofits that don't necessarily have the ownership component, but they have the decision making. And I'm happy to go into those more too if the people are interested in that. But today we're focusing on worker co-ops that have both of these components, right? And then a little bit about the national movement of worker co-ops. There's around 1,000 worker co-ops. It's hard to, get the exact number. If you count all the co-ops in formation, it's probably over that. Um, we verified 612 a couple years ago in our census, and a few years before that, it was 326. So it's a growing movement for sure, and our capacity to measure it is increasing. And that represents well over 10,000 workers now, probably closer to 12,000 with some of the larger cooperatives. And we have over 400 members now in our US Federation. Got to update some of these numbers as things grow. But that's still relatively small compared to other co-op sectors, right? If you look at consumer cooperatives that include those large type of co-ops that I mentioned, they represent, many millions of members. But we're a deep co-op, right? This is people's workplaces. This is a deep connection to their cooperatives, and our members are very connected to different social movements and social change efforts for sure. Um, so yeah, that's just a little bit of background. And the racial demographics of worker co-ops are, a majority Black, Indigenous people of color owned cooperatives. Um, Worker co-op owners at least. And that's partially because there's a large, strong tradition of co-ops in Latin American communities, right? Folks from Central America who bring their co-op traditions and are involved in immigrant-led co-ops in the US. Um, and some of these stats don't even include the drivers co-op, which is over 2,500 workers. That is, like a worker-led alternative to Lyft and Uber. Um, that is 91% immigrant-owned workforce. So these numbers are shifting too in the direction of, BIPOC and immigrant-owned companies. Though there's folks of all different demographics involved. We kind of have this, vision of the hippies, 70s, food co-op movement when we think of co-ops. That's not really the case in worker co-ops, and there's a well-documented history of Black cooperatives, and this book is highly recommended and linked to in the links document that, about the African American co-ops going back to the Knights of Labor and many others. So Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nemhart is a great resource on that. Um, and let's talk a little bit about the internationally recognized co-op principles, right? These are co-ops in general, international principles, um, and how these show up in the worker co-op sector. So voluntary and open membership doesn't mean you need to let anyone into your business at any time or hire anyone who knocks on the door. If you've hired someone and they're a good fit for the job and they're eligible for membership as you've laid out, then it is important that you have a fair and equitable membership process. That's what this means, right? Your hiring process is non-discriminatory, and your membership process is one that is open uh, to employees. And so this is where anti-oppression and equity work shows up currently in these principles. There's work on an eighth one that is more explicit around that work, but currently that's where it lies. So make sure in your hiring that you're you're thinking about equity, anti-discrimination, anti-oppression work. And then in your membership process, right, when you include people as full member owners, make sure that's something that's non-discriminatory. Democratic member control number two, we've talked about a little bit too. It's the premise that the workplace is one that is based in democracy, right? And at the minimum, a member, when someone becomes a full member, they have access to the major decisions in the co-op. That means eligibility to run for the board of directors if you have a board, or to vote to elect the board of directors if you have that structure, or if you have a collective non-hierarchical structure without a board, then it's making lots of decisions on a weekly basis, maybe around the major decisions that affect the co-op members. And so that's especially on the governance side, right? It's important to early on distinguish what is operations, right? What are day-to-day, in the field kind of decisions that you may want to assign to a team, or managers might make some of those decisions if you have a management structure. And what is governance? Because governance should be membership involvement, whether it's electing a board to really hold that governance, but being accountable to the full membership, or it's a collective process where you take separate agendas, right? This is a governance agenda, a board's type agenda that is making lasting policies, right? So if you can think about it, right? Lasting policy kind of thing, our bylaws, our membership process, how we distribute profit, our overall annual budget, that's all governance and important to have on a board agenda or a governance committee agenda, and have those items be, alerted ahead of time. And then your operations can be your weekly staff meetings, or, all hands kind of meetings. So distinguish between those and avoid a lot of potential issues early on if possible. Member economic participation, principle 3, we also mentioned there's usually some sort of shared risk and reward, right? You're buying into the co-op somehow. Founders may, have contributed quite a bit in sweat equity, and but usually pay some sort of fee, right? Members pay some sort of fee and then are eligible for profit sharing, right? The distribution of surplus usually goes to the members of the cooperative, and that's a principle. And it's usually based, we'll be talking about it more, but based on hours worked in a worker co-op. And that's called patronage. You don't have to have a fee that is really high or prohibitive to the kind of members you want to attract. But it's often good to pick a fee that is significant, right? And you may need that fee to capitalize your co-op. You may need some serious equity from folks to start your co-op, depending on your needs. And there's lots of ways to set up that buy-in, that people can do it over time, things like that, to make it more accessible. Autonomy and independence doesn't mean you can't be highly federated or have, close relationships with other co-ops, or, be a member of our federation and therefore, be really close to different co-ops. But it does mean you can't be a subsidiary of a larger corporation, or be beholden to a government entity of some sort. You as a co-op can have subsidiaries, but to fulfill this principle, you can't be beholden to a larger entity. A nonprofit could help start a co-op and hold on to some, connection to that co-op long term, but they usually can't have forever veto power in a co-op and fulfill this principle and things like that. You can be franchised, right? But each co-op needs to have its own independence and autonomy. Education, training, and information is an active thing in worker co-ops, right? It's not just something people have access to, it's something that is actively shared, and there's leadership development that happens, and ongoing education work and access to broader education that makes that allows you to really flex the muscle of democratic member control. If you don't have, that active kind of education and training and leadership development, then it's hard to really carry out real democracy in the workplace. Principle 6 is seen all over the world where co-ops are working together, right? Cooperation among cooperatives is such an important one. We often shorten it to P6, right? Principle 6, P6. There's a conference in Maine of co-ops working together. It's called the P6 conference. I was inspired by co-ops in Argentina when I was doing some documentary film work down there, where the Sanon factory in the south was sending up tiles to help rebuild this Bowen four-star hotel that was serving as the Congress meeting place for all the worker co-ops and recovered workplaces that were happening, after the economic crisis, and people coming together with that hotel, and then a shoe factory that was Adidas, and then the United Footwear Cooperative came together to do joint childcare, and and we're joining each other's protests on the street to expropriate the equipment in each of these factories and things. So you see this kind of cooperation in lots of different ways. You might see it in supply chain work, right? Co-ops buying from other co-ops and finding a niche of selling to co-ops and things like that. Or you might find it in just getting support, right? Finding other co-ops in your industry and see how they do this, X, Y, Z. So, feel free to reach out to us and we can help you connect to other co-ops. You'd be surprised like, how much co-ops are willing to share their documents and, budgets and things like that, that might be useful as you put together your plans. And then finally, principle 7, concern for community looks like different things in different places, right? It's that commitment to community, not doing harm, but doing, positive improvement for your community. Might be a commitment to anti-gentrification in your community, or environmental justice, or greening the process in your, company or factory or something like that. But it's an important principle as well. So those are the 7 internationally recognized cooperative principles for co-ops in general. There are also worker co-op principles or union co-op principles that have been adapted from Mondragon principles. Mondragon is a big co-op conglomerate, worker co-op conglomerate in Basque country, Spain, right? Um, where there's other principles that incorporate the sovereignty of labor, right? Or the instrumental and subordinate nature of capital. That's a mouthful. That basically means that capital is important, right, to get a co-op, any business going, but it needs to be subordinate to the people, right? People over profit, basically, is what that says. And then participation in management, right? Participatory management is a principle of worker co-ops that is worked on regularly. Wage solidarity might be another principle, where you might set in your bylaws that the highest paid member is not making more than 3x the lowest paid worker, or whatever that ratio makes sense in your industry, right? But there's some sort of wage solidarity. So yeah, you can check out, there's links to those union co-op principles and some great graphics that a union print shop, Works Printing, did in the info document, the links document. The aims of worker co-ops are really around this shared decision-making, shared wealth, right? As a wealth building process, community, shared vision and culture. And I'd love to hear from you all, like what really inspired you to come across the worker co-op model? What, you can share it in the chat or come off mute. Like for my worker co-op, we were really interested in telling the stories of grassroots organizations, right? And so we saw the need, and we wanted to build jobs for youth in our community. So Future Focused Media Co-op came together to kind of meet those needs and to build wealth in Worcester, low-income communities where youth didn't have access to jobs that were just beyond, minimum wage-based jobs. And so those were some of our motivations. But I'd love to hear you all, like, why have you come to this model? Feel free to share any of that in the chat or come off mute. And while we do that, I would also, oh,
Hi, I thought I'd
yeah,
share a little bit.
go
My,
ahead,
my
Joe.
name's Bicycle Joe. I represent Veterans Vintage. Vinyl is our first phase of operation. I recognized the need personally during the pandemic because I lost my job and I've aged out of the job market. So I am a veteran, and we have a benefit that many people don't know about in most states, but definitely in New York State, where we can get vendors' licenses to actually sell things on the street. Yeah, New York is full of all kinds of vendors, but veterans get to go to the head of the line and do not pay any fees for the first year, or first 2 years, I should say. But there is a lot of red tape in getting that done. So what Veterans Vintage will be is a small business services organization for veterans, but at the same time, we are going to create a system for logistics for these veterans to set them up in their own businesses and run the cooperative as a small business association. That's basically where we're headed. We're looking to form a board, and we've actually got a brick and mortar location in Manhattan now, about 2-3 blocks from the Veterans Hospital. And we're going to be outdoors in the springtime in front of the VA, recruiting members for the cooperative. Thanks.
Thank you. And I hear people are here, to transform lawns into prairie land and foodscapes and ecological landscaping. And I see apparel and food system work, working with the homeless population to build, jobs and things. And there's a lot of great work. And so a lot of us come with that passion, right, around a certain social justice issue. And we're looking for a, sustainable way to address those issues and create work as we do it, right? So successful co-ops have those three components, right? They're democratically organized, right? They embody the principles that we, have just talked about, and they are a profitable business that are sustainable financially, right? That's important, and that they benefit the community. And there's so many great examples out there. The Anti-Oppression and Resource Training Alliance, aorta.coop, is a great example where they're trainers and facilitators, right? And they're fully democratic in the way they have structured their co-op. They also run a really, a profitable business for sure. It's financially sustainable, and they pay their facilitators well above, what, independent contractors might be getting in that industry. And it benefits the community broadly in their work doing facilitation, anti-oppression work, conflict mediation trainings. They put a lot of their materials out there for community use and do train the trainer models. So that's just one example. There's so many out there too. But that's, we're trying to embody all of this as we create our co-ops. And I just want to mention conversion of an existing company to a co-op as a way that a lot of people come to this movement as well, right? They have a business and they want to see it transform into worker ownership into a co-op. And that transformation can be a messy, emergent kind of process, right? As you go from, one owner or a couple owners into a cooperatively owned entity. And it's irreversible, right? You become that co-op and you don't go back to a sole proprietorship. But the result can be a beautiful butterfly, right? It can embody a commitment to gender justice, or to really sharing not just the financial ownership of a company, but the ownership of the culture. And it can be a great way to preserve, the legacy that people have created in a company. So help spread the word if you know business owners that this is potentially a good thing for exiting owners, right? Retiring owners, or for people who want to grow the business with the employees, right? Or somewhere in between, right? People want to grow it and eventually have an exit strategy. So there's a lot of great resources for those folks, and people that can talk to them about the tax benefits, um, and the structures on how to do it. Becoming employee owned is a great resource. Um, Great. So yeah, some people here are coming with that conversion model. So when we say conversion, that's what we're talking about, taking an existing company, converting it to a co-op. And there's a lot of great resources out there, support organizations, and we've come together in the Workers to Owners Collaborative that can be found at becomingemployeeowned.org. And they have an intake process too. Our sister Think and Do Tank Democracy at Work Institute runs that collaborative. So check that out if you know someone or if you're in that boat. A lot of what we'll be talking about is startup focused, but will be relevant to people coming from that too. So the rest of this is really thinking about the different, work areas and how to distribute those work areas and what to consider as specific to worker co-ops. But it's also a way of organizing that work. So if you have a team or are building a team, this might be a good way to think about who holds what work, right? So think about that as we go forward. Who is good at the culture and framework and internal work? um, and who might be good at the business development or entrepreneurship or legal structure and framework, and who might be the networker, the ecosystem development, connecting with communities. And so we'll be going into details of each of these areas. The first one being that internal functioning, right, around vision, membership, delegation of work, and accountability. There's a lot to be said around that specific to co-ops. Um, So, moving past the lone genius idea, right? In Future Focus Co-op, for example, I was really passionate about documentary film work and telling stories through documentaries, but some of my coworkers had more experience in working with nonprofits and helping them share their promotional videos. And some people had more of the youth training components. So coming together and forming a learning group. We went through a co-op academy. There are a lot of co-op academies around the country. You can look up if there's one that in your region, or do an online one, like the LA Co-op Lab has an online self-paced one you can do. So you can do these learning groups, right, as you go. And what's important is that you meet regularly, have a clear agenda, right? And are building that shared vision. It's not just you as the sole entrepreneur that's bringing everything. You have to be open to a broader vision. And as we did that in Future Focus, the result was definitely more beautiful and more encompassing of what we had capacity to do as a co-op. But it took a year of meeting together and hashing out that broader vision. Um, and it's important that it's focused around a common economic and social need, right? You're meeting some sort of need that you've already identified, right? As an entrepreneur, you've seen that need, but you also have to make sure that there's an economic need to support that, which we'll be talking about more. Another great example that has done this shared vision work in a great way was Riquezas del Campo, a farm co-op in Western Massachusetts where people came together around wage theft in a workers' center, right? They were out on the street and organizing together. But they all had a co-op experience from their home countries in Central America and brought that and said, how do we form a co-op together that meets our family's needs for healthy food, but also our broader community's needs to access to purchasing healthy farm fresh food. So they formed that co-op, but it took a year of meeting together with support from that worker center and others, to figure out how they were going to do that. How are they going to form an LLC co-op that is really set up to have um, people paying with ITIN tax numbers, right? Um, and I can go more into that, but that's just an example of how that big group of immigrant workers came together to form a co-op and a broader vision. Um, and then this first arena is also clarifying membership. What are the expectations of your steering committee if it's before fully formed co-op? And then what is the expectation of a member? What are the rights and responsibilities of members? What are the contributions of people coming to your initial meetings? And what are the contributions that you'll be requiring of members going forward? The rights and responsibilities, we have a whole workshop about this, but let's look what it looks like briefly in some of these topics around financial participation, right? Worker owners should have some sort of right to patronage, right? To profit sharing, right? And that's usually based on hours worked in co-ops. You tally it up at the end of the year is the most common way, and then you distribute the profits based on that to the members, right? So full membership rights is to patronage, but you also have the responsibility on the financial end to pay some sort of fee, to provide your labor, to be involved in the budgeting process, and maybe losses. And then education, right? You have rights to educational opportunities, but you have the responsibility to educate yourself and others, right? An active education again. On the governance side, right, decision making and policies, you have the right to vote or run for the board or to be part of committees that are making important decisions. But you also have that responsibility to show up, to vote, to carry out autogestión, right? This self-management, self-governance kind of process where you're learning to balance the needs of the collective, of the co-op, and your personal needs, right? You're representing both your individual needs and your co-op needs, and balancing that is not something we're taught how to do very well in this society. So learning that and being actively involved in governance is a responsibility. Information, you should have the right to see what the bylaws are, policies, financial information, but there's also the responsibility to be transparent about it. And there's so much more that could be said, but yeah. The slides are in the links document. There's a link to the slides right in there. You can feel free to use portions of these to educate other folks, whatever. Yeah. So, and then this first arena is also thinking about the delegation of work. If you're a good delegator and a good, group facilitator, this might be your arena to hold. So not letting one person do everything, finding real tasks for folks, and finding places to plug in, people to plug in that are getting involved in your steering committee. And then once you've set up that delegation, setting up systems of accountability. If there's one concrete thing I can share with you all today, it's that accountability is a practice that needs to be built as early as possible, right? So you don't have this kind of culture of, yeah, people drop balls all the time. That can really bite you in the long run, right? If you set up systems of accountability early on, it can really impact your effectiveness later on. So right, this can be as simple as a to-do list that you maintain and bring up at meetings or other places where tasks are given very clear names and explain what's the deliverable, right? And when does it need to be done by, and who is the individual responsible for making that task done, right? There might be a team working on it, overseeing it. There might be another support person, but who's doing it? What is the task and by when? There's plenty of software, that help you manage projects and tasks, right? Asana and Monday and Trello and all those can be helpful. Whatever you set up and makes sense for your process, but do it and check in on it regularly, right? Bring it to meetings or have it in a place where people are coming together regularly. Um, and then follow through on it, right? Check in with people. Why, why hasn't someone done something? Not like, why haven't you done this, but why haven't you done this, right? Like figure out what's happening behind the dropped balls. Do you need more information? Do you need support? Do you need reminders? Do you have too much on your plate? What is going on? And if you are the person holding this accountability process, really try to think the underlying issues and make sure that people are held accountable to do what they said they've done. And if you do this, it prevents 80% of conflict that I've seen come up in co-ops, right? Is a lack of clarity of who's going to do what or lack of follow through. There's a lot more that can be said about conflict, and conflict is something that will come up in any workplace, and in hierarchical workplaces, it's often dealt with in punitive or firings. And in worker co-ops, that's different, right? So we have lots of resources to help think about a more generative process around conflict. How can you become closer through conflict? How can you have processes that really are ready to address deeper underlying issues that might come out in a workplace conflict? So, but in terms of accountability, a lot of that can be prevented. So set up those systems. And let's give a fictitious but fun example of a co-op that went through this. Um, you know, the llama pepper farm loved their growing their peppers and having the llamas roam around. And they were just so passionate about that work, they forgot to set up a whole bunch of things. They had unclear roles in the meetings. They realized some major things were getting dropped. There was some real resentment building up. Um, so they took a pause after a few months of that mess and said, we need some systems of accountability. So they set up that task list that I just mentioned, right? And started using Asana to track their tasks and to assign things and to check it off and to celebrate accomplishments. But they also set up clear roles, right? These, teams were in charge of this, and this person on the team was in charge of this. And out of that, they were able to do really clear work plans. And once they had clear work plans, they had something, a basis to do really effective evaluations. And they were a collective, right? They didn't have a manager, to evaluate the work performance of, their underlings, but but they did peer evaluations, right? They checked in with each other on a regular basis. Even if people were doing great, they had a place to do those evaluations, and mostly were positive, keep doing it. But they had places to bring up issues before they became huge issues, and work plans to figure out, to have a basis for those evaluations. And then they also, created grievance systems, right? They knew there was going to be harms, happening at some point in the co-op, and they needed to have a system of grievance, suspension, and even expulsion, right? They needed to figure out a system so that to be able to remove a member if they were becoming too harmful for the co-op in a way that was not going to bind them up forever. But they also had some positive things. They put into place a mentorship an improved onboarding process to get people oriented to their decision making. And then, once they had a lot of those processes in place with the support of a technical assistance provider, they had much more effective meetings. And so they could go out there and grow their peppers and get spit on by their llamas, and had a much more effective second year in the co-op. So learn from their experience if you can. So that's that first arena, right? Co-op capacity, the internal work. That might be you as an organizer of this startup, or maybe it's someone else who holds that kind of internal work. But the second arena we're talking about is co-op development. And I know some of you have business experience, so the initial principles of creating value for customers might be, a given, but it's an important thing to have, understood across the board. And then you're also thinking about the right legal form, which is a very co-op specific thing, raising capital, which can look different for worker co-ops, and then management structure if you have one. So creating value for customers, right? As I mentioned, a lot of us come to this with passion, and we have this intrinsic idea that, this is needed for me and my few friends, so of course it's needed in a broader scale, but you need to prove that, right? You need to make sure that's actually the case, and what you're offering your good or service is clearly articulated and meets a need, that will create a revenue source that's sustainable, right? If you're not generating enough revenue, then you won't be able to do all the mission work, right? So so who are your customers? Where do they get their information? Where do they make their decision making? Their purchasing decisions. What are the issues they're facing? The key problems they're facing, and what are you offering that is creating something that is different than their current options, right? Is it more accessible? Does it have better language access? Is it more affordable? Is it higher value, higher quality? What is it that you're creating that is, has some additional value for your target customers? And be able to articulate all that really well. And so there's a lot of tools out there, right, that are linked in the resource document um, for business, small businesses in general to do this, right? And maybe they'll use a lean startup model, right, where you go out and you test your market and you validate, some of the assumptions, or you might need to pivot and then continue to build. Um, and but what's important is that you get real customer feedback, whether you're using surveys or focus groups. Um, but you're getting some sort of feedback that says, yes, there's a market out there for this, and we're going to be sustainable, and we're going to have revenue. People will pay what we need, to charge for this, and there's a good fit, right? And marketing looks a little different in co-ops or solidarity economy processes, right? You're probably not going to have a hugely ad-based process. It's usually more relational, right? In solidarity economy or co-op businesses, right? You're thinking about how do you really build on the relationships you have or can build, and really create value and have people that are gaining value from your product or service share it with their friends, and that kind of thing. So your marketing plan might look different than a traditional business, um, but it's important to have one, right? And but you might be able to get support on a lot of that business kind of work, on your business plan or feasibility study from small business support organizations that don't fully get co-ops. That's okay. They can still help you on your financial projections, on your market study, on your market analysis, on your market plan. Um, on your sales funnel, sales plan, all that kind of stuff. There are small business development centers, SBDCs. There are SCORE, retired folks who help people for free. There's Center for Women in Enterprise. There's lots of different groups. So you might want to find those kind of supports on your business plan to really create that value. And feel free to, yeah, the resource document, I sent it out in the beginning. I'll send it again right now for people to have that. Has a link to the slides that I'm sharing and to a lot of the other resources, right? So one example for this, figuring out your value proposition, but in a co-op way, there's start.coop has a great co-op business canvas, right? You might have heard of the business model canvas that does this. There's one specific for co-ops that's linked in the links document that I just shared. So lots to be said about that, but make sure you have a solid revenue stream that, if you're creating this company, that it can be sustainable. And then you can really impact, have that impact in the social justice mission that we often have behind all out of this. The startup process, wouldn't it be great if it were linear like this, right? You have your idea, you build your team, done, check. Business plan, complete. Your governance and policy documents, in stone. Legal entity, formed and totally done. Operation, great. Uh, it's much more of a iterative, looping, you know, messy process. And that overlapping process is okay, right? Hopefully you have a team working on different components, maybe simultaneously, right? And to be able to return to your business plan after you've been in partial operation is a good thing, right? You can revisit these documents. And you won't have all of your policy and HR documents when you start. That's all right. But you may need to have formed your legal entity before you get a loan or raise some serious capital, right? So there is, some flow to this, but know that you might be coming back to some processes and that it's not as linear as we might expect. The legal entity, we get a lot of questions about this, and happy to go, answer questions about this too. I'm not a lawyer, but I've seen a lot of different approaches. Um, and what I encourage you to do is not just sit down right away with a lawyer and say, okay, what's best for me, is to answer some key questions first and then sit down with a lawyer. So you're not just driven in a direction that one lawyer is used to. Oh, we know limited liability companies, LLCs really well. You should just do that. It's flexible. You can make anything happen under an LLC. That might be true, right? Plenty of co-ops use LLCs because of their flexibility and because you can be taxed as a partnership taxed as an owner, right? And international people or undocumented people that use ITINs can use LLCs, right, in partnerships in a safer way. But corporations might be better too for different tax purposes, or because you want to have baked into your co-op, certain practices and democratic principles. You might want to use a cooperative corporation statute, right? There are co-op corporations in most states, but a lot of them are set up for consumer or ag co-ops. So you might be lucky enough to be in a state that has an employee cooperative corporation or a worker co-op statute, and that might be a great fit too. Or you might want to incorporate, if you're in multiple states, in a co-op, in a state that has a good co-op statute, or a limited cooperative association, which kind of mixes the great flexibility of an LLC with a cooperative corporation. But you don't need to know all those right away. What you need to do is answer, how do people become members? How do we make decisions? What's the cost to join? How will profit be distributed? Do we need outside investors? Do we have undocumented folks who are going to be part of our membership, or international folks paying with ITINs? And then you can sit down with a co-op lawyer, ideally, right? Someone who really gets co-ops. And if you don't know one, we can help you connect to one. And then set up your bylaws and find the right entity, or set up the right entity and then create your bylaws, that that fit your needs, right? C corporations could work for you, right? Um, and then your bylaws say you're a co-op, and the IRS taxes you as a co-op. If you're doing certain kinds of, investor capital raises, that might be good. Or if you really want to have the ownership taxation, or if you can't afford to pay workers' comp for a certain amount of time, maybe an LLC is the right, not that I recommend that, but if that's a reality, an LLC might be the way to go. So answer some of those questions, find the right legal entity. I'm happy to go into more about that, but have some issues around taxes and things like that figured out a little bit ahead of time before sitting down with a lawyer if possible. And to just go over some of the components of co-op taxation, which in the IRS speak is subchapter T. This is just a great mechanism to know that exists. You don't need to jump right into it, but this is how it works, right? Here, a member has a top hat, and a non-member in a subchapter T corporation, they're employees, right? They're both employees, but the member, is the one with the top hat for these purposes. But they're both employees. They get a W-2 at the end of the year. They sign a W-4 when they join as an employee. And then the net profit generated is called surplus in these subchapter T corporations. And then profit that's generated by the non-members is called profit and is taxed at the corporate level. And then it goes into a collective account, right? It's taxed at that corporate level for the profit. And then the surplus that's generated by the members has some really interesting things that can be done with it. Again, you don't need to know all the details of this. There's accountants to help you set up these processes, but know that this exists, right? The surplus, you can distribute some of it to a collective account and pay taxes at the corporate level on that. But a lot of it should go to the workers who created that surplus, right? So you can distribute it as member patronage. Usually it's done, you close your end of the year books. You say, oh, great, we have all this surplus. We're going to distribute it based on hours worked is the most common. There's a few other ways to do it, but so if people, work twice the hours, they get twice the profit share. It's not based on their compensation rate, which can, be a different scale that you set up. But that's taxed at the individual level, right? If you're distributing those taxes to the individual. And then there's a separate cool thing you can do if you are doing member patronage, that you can do some of it in cash. You have to do at least 20% because they're paying taxes on it, so they have to cover those taxes. But some of it can go into what are called internal capital accounts or individual capital accounts. That's like an IOU. Hey, we're going to keep this capital because we need to grow. But it's yours when you leave the co-op or when we can afford to pay it out. It's yours, and when you get it, it's usually tax-free, right? You've already paid the taxes on that, and it's a great way to avoid the double taxation of being taxed at the corporate level and then individual level, but reinvesting some of your surplus in the co-op. Anyway, You don't need to know the details, but subchapter T taxation is a cool thing if you can get there. Um, and then you're also thinking about ways to raise capital, right? The second arena thinks about, do we get a loan? There's a lot of great lenders out there that lend to co-ops specifically, right? You might go to a bank and say, there's four of us, we're starting this co-op business. And they're like, who's going to sign on the dotted line? I don't know if I want to lend to you. But you go to Shared Capital Cooperative or the Co-op Fund in the Northeast or Seed Commons or um, National Cooperative Bank, and they'll say, oh yeah, we know co-ops and we're not going to require a credit score from each of you or for you to put up your car as collateral. This is collective debt that you're getting. We want to see a strong business plan, that your assumptions in your business plan are backed up. We want to see that you're connected to other co-ops. And some of them might require some collateral, right? Which is what you put up in case the loan goes bad. So they don't lose everything, right, as lenders, but they can be more creative sometimes. So yeah, figure out if you have a good fit lender. There are a lot of those are linked in the resource document. And then if you're looking for equity investment, that's a great way to go, where you can get like patient capital that you only have to pay back when you have an upside, right? When you can pay it back. Um, and maybe members are going to invest additional equity in the co-op. That's great too. Um, but be careful about securities laws, right? Whenever you're promising some sort of return on an equity investment, be careful of those securities laws and get a lawyer involved. And also be really clear to equity investors that they're not going to get a big voting share, right? That's often the case in startups, right? I'm investing big equity. I want to vote. I want a seat on the board. That's not how it works in co-ops. You're looking for the equity investors that understand that we're just an investor and we're going to hopefully, we back the mission of this and we're hoping to get a return if and when you can pay that. So that's how equity investment happens in co-ops. And just make sure, you don't charge it all to a credit card with super high interest. Do it right, form your entity, get a loan or set up a direct public offering, which is another way to get lots of smaller investors instead of the big accredited investors. There's lots of great ways to do that. Co-ops have raised millions and millions through creative ways and equity investment and things like that. But set it up right, And there's also creative ways, crowdfunding and bartering and pre-selling, and ways to do that collectively. So you'll be, the second arena is really setting up this capitalization. And you are also thinking about the governance and management system. Now, to keep you on your feet, the people with hats are not members, they are board members if you have a board. So here are the members that are in this group here, right? And then they've elected a board of directors in this one example. And the board of directors hires and oversees a manager or management team, and the management team oversees the workers, and they hire and fire the workers, right? So there's a cyclical thing, and that's common in larger co-ops. Equal Exchange, for example, has over 100 member owners in the fair trade, business that they run. So they elect a board who oversees the co-CEOs and the management team. They can hire and fire those managers, right? But the managers are overseeing the workers, including the members. Um, but you may want a different structure. You may want a committee-based structure, or you may want everyone to be on the board. And your committees might be, you know, kind of a team-based structure. You could use sociocracy or holocracy, which is a dynamic governance, team-based system that has circles that are highly empowered to make decisions around different things, and then have a general circle to coordinate the division of of the work and decision-making power. There's links to that in the resource document. Sociocracy for All has a whole section on co-ops and has a great structure to carry out if that's one that fits, the way you want to run things. You can really set up any structure on the management side, right? You can be a collective, you can have a manager. Um, and on the governance side, right, you can have a board or you can be a collective on the governance side too. You really figure out the way you want to do it, or figure out another co-op that's done something pretty similar and you want to, start from that and then adapt it to your needs too. So that structure can really be what you make of it, but you want to be clear about that as you get going. So that's that second arena around business development. Maybe you're good at the financial projections and you're going to hold a lot of that second arena side. The third one is around ecosystem, connecting to other folks, creating the conditions that will make you more successful and co-ops in your, you know, your ecosystem more successful. So it's thinking about technical assistance, connecting to social movements, customer commitments, government support. Technical assistance, there's a growing number of groups that are out there to support co-ops, right? Not one group or person is going to be able to do everything for you, right? We have a service provider directory that's on screen here and linked in the resource document that has folks in different regions that offer this support. You can find them or reach out to us and we can connect you. Co-op developers, right? Those organizations that have co-op developers or individuals sometimes are really great at the group processes, the democratic decision process, and a lot of that kind of stuff, right? Like I mentioned, there's a lot of groups that are good at the small business stuff, right? The marketing study or financial projections. The lenders are really good at looking at your business plan and projections and giving feedback on that. But you can piece together different things, right? Our our clinic can provide technical assistance on, certain things that are co-op specific, or on business plans. Um, but yeah, try to find, this third arena is really piecing together that network of support. And then connecting to social movements. We are coming to this often with a mission to be catalyst for change. We can connect to other groups who are doing that work. But we've seen that it takes ongoing effort to maintain that commitment to social justice, right? A lot of founding teams are clear on that and have that out the gate. But then if it's not incorporated in your hiring and membership processes, that can be diluted or lost, right? So yeah, take the intentionality into your hiring process to educate folks around your co-op model, around your commitment to social justice, and hire with that in mind, and then have a membership process that maintains that, right? Make sure people are committed to that before they become full decision makers in your co-op. And then if you're saying you're doing all that, live up to it, right? Be accountable to that, and that will help our broader movement. Um, Great. Michael has some experience with sociocracy. Cool. Any other questions around this social movement piece? It's a really key one. Or thoughts or examples? I have a few examples. There's so many in our movement. Cooperation Jackson, that's been doing organizing with, Black liberation stuff in the South for so long, in Jackson, Mississippi, has a great network of small co-ops. Mandela Food Co-op has a great commitment to food justice and food security in their community. They're a natural food store, but also work on larger food justice work. Design Action Collective in the Bay Area does the artwork for a lot of movements on a sliding scale fee. There's so many more examples out there. Um, and then you might want to consider the union co-op model. People are like, wait, we're worker owned. Why do we also need to be unionized? And so it may not be a natural thing, but it is an actual great, marriage that we've seen happen between cooperatives and unions in a lot of areas, right? Unions bring a lot of things to co-ops, right? They have experience around grievance processes, health insurance, a lot of those kind of things. It's another layer of worker protection if you go to scale. There's always stratification of power that happens, and workers need voice in lots of different ways, and a union or collective bargaining process is another way to have that. And then also through a union, you can have organizing power and industry impact, right? We have a council that meets regularly, that you can listen in on them by monthly calls or check out the unioncoops.org website that we maintain, that connect, the dozens and dozens of worker co-ops that are also unionized. Mondragon, the large worker co-op conglomerate in Basque Country, had had workers councils built into the process, right? And we're seeing growing number of worker co-ops building in this, worker council or collective bargaining unit into the model as they grow. There's some great examples of that. Co-op Cincy is doing great work around this. That's linked there too. And then in the Bronx, a great example of that industry impact, the Cooperative Home Care Associates, has over 2,000 workers and linked up with SEIU union to really, do better on the worker safety components and on the collective bargaining. It's not like a sit down combative kind of approach, right? It's the union reps are sitting down with managers to say, what can we figure out? What can we afford as a co-op? What are the real needs of the frontline workers here, and figuring out that the contract on a regular basis, and through that work with SEIU, they've had an impact on home care, on the wage levels and benefits and workplace safety of home care workers, not just in New York City, but across the country. So that's a great success example of that industry impact. So getting commitment and input from customers, we talked about in terms of demonstrating need, but also your networker person or team would be good to think about this, right? Do you do pre-sales or coupons, fundraisers? Do you win contracts for the education or medical institutions, the anchor institutions, right, that have maybe in their mission to support the local community? Can they buy from your co-ops? Can you grow your co-op or company to be to get a contract from those anchors? Can you engage customers with polls or forums or boards or social media, right? How do you get that direct input? And then government goals, right? Are you a preferred vendor for your municipality or state government that is purchasing? Or are you, getting certain certifications as a minority or women-owned business if you're BIPOC-led or women-led? And then workforce development dollars, right? A lot of municipalities or states have workforce development initiatives. That's like funding to pay for your training or technical assistance or whatever. So get access to those either with a partner that's, getting those dollars or directly to train up your workforce. And then maybe there's geographic incentives. Maybe there's a grant from your city to do a sign, right? To put up a sign or to start a business in a certain geography you're already looking at. So figuring out those alignments is in that third arena. So thinking about where you're strong and where you want to build your team, right, is a big component of the startup process, right? To think who is going to be holding different components of this. And as you build your team, it's important to think about equity in all its different fronts, right? And in Future Focus, we were, diverse in terms of class and race and age, but we were all cisgendered men, all four of us that started Future Focus, and we found pretty quickly, that we had created this culture that was not as inclusive to women and non-binary folks, and we had to do a lot of work on that. And if we had remembered that equity component as we were forming our founding team, we would have been much more effective in that. So, if you're building your team, you might be, just inviting people to a meeting and see how they jive and are taking on projects or are interested, or maybe you have a more intentional process where you're actually doing like a job interview, even if you're not hiring the person yet. But you're seeing if their skills match, but also their commitments and values match, right? And that they understand this is an ownership role, not just an employer kind of situation. So yeah, another way to think about this distribution is, someone's great at the group process, they might want to hold that. Someone's good at the spreadsheets and the business stuff, they want to hold that. Someone's really good at mobilizing. So think about those strengths and maybe organize your group around this. Shared vision, membership, decision-making, hiring is all in that first bucket. Your product, your finances, your management. These teams aren't doing all of that, but they're researching, they're bringing back proposals to the team, right? And then the community connection is the third arena, the marketing, the customer service, the suppliers, the alliances, right? We are coming up on the question and answer section, so start dropping those in the chat or thinking about what questions you have or discussion points you want to bring up. But a little bit more about our, our federation. We maintain the service provider directory. We have partners in different areas. We can help you connect to ecosystems in your areas if there is one. There are many more stars than are on this map, are involved in our network, and we can help connect you, or by industry too. And then there's a lot of resources online. The Sustainable Economies Law Center has great legal resources for co-ops and democratic workplaces, so nonprofits that are considering worker self-directed nonprofits. They have a lot of great stuff there. And they have a regular legal cafe where you can go and ask legal questions. The Democracy at Work Institute is our sister Think and Do organization that has a great searchable resource library at institute.coop. And then we have a lot of good resources on our website at usworker.coop. We have packages, right? If you don't know what you want, or need, some packages are listed there. But more importantly, we have these free mini guides, right? If you are figuring out your onboarding or hiring process or team building process, we have a 3 or 4 page document that can point you in the right direction for worker co-op stuff specifically. Because it's sometimes hard to navigate all the online resources. So that's the goal of these mini guides, right? We have one on conflict, one on getting funding for all that. Now you need all this technical assistance, getting funding to pay for all that, getting financing in general, setting your membership fees, structure and decision making, board practices. We have a lot of founders compensation. That's a whole nother topic we haven't gotten too much here, but as founders, you all should be tracking your time, tracking your investments, and getting some compensation for that later on, because it impacts, power dynamics. It's just good practice, and you deserve it too. So yeah, check out that guide on founders compensation. And then we have some grants. We have a grant for that supports rural organizations, right? If the majority of your folks are in a rural area, or if you're incorporated with a rural address according to USDA, we have some funds that can cover technical assistance costs. Our advisors can work with you for free. And we are applying for grants that would, support low income and BIPOC-led initiatives too. Basically, our co-op clinic works this way, right? You go to usworker.coop/clinic, you click get support. We do an intake call with staff. You get some resources directly right away. And then if there's a clear project, we set you up with an advisor from our network, or we might refer you to a better, service provider. But, our network of 20 advisors might be the right fit. And then we have a fee for service kind of thing, and we connect you to them, and then we send you a bill or an evaluation thing if it's covered by a grant. Our webinars have been sponsored by .coop, which is a great place to get a domain if you're looking at a co-op specific domain. And the good thing is you can have like, prairies.coop or, whatever, some very, identifying word .coop is probably available, right? And you do have to get, some referrals to make sure that you're truly in the co-op arena, but it's a great thing, and it's led by co-op movement organizations, the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA, and NCBA CLUSA, and International Cooperative Alliance are behind this .coop. So identity.coop to go get those domains. And just one more thing about the federation. Our federation is the only grassroots, group that's representing, organizing with worker co-ops and democratic workplaces in the US. And we try to provide some really, valuable benefits. That could be technical assistance, that could be health-related benefits, right? It's hard to get a good dental and vision plan if you're a small business. We can help you with that. Peer networks, right? Other people in your industry or similar. If you're a tech co-op, we have an active tech peer network. or member councils, right, to engage on policy levels, or racial and economic justice, or Movimiento de Inmigrantes en Cooperativas, another member council for immigrant co-ops, and then discounts on events and things like that. So even if you're not a full co-op yet, or you're converting, or you're a startup, you can join and get access to all these member benefits. You just can't be voting until you're a formal worker co-op and get kind of verified. But yeah, please engage with our advocacy efforts. It's a lot of what we do is around advocacy work. We have, oh, open enrollment just ended. So that's a little old slide, but there are some ways to get in on those member benefits if that's of interest. We have a sustainer too, if you want to support our work on a regular basis. Donations are very welcome. And we maintain a shop co-op section of the website too. Those are linked in the links document. We have the National Worker Co-op Conference coming up in September in Chicago, so check that out. Yeah, so that's what I have to share. I'd love to hear questions. I think we have one here in the chat already. Let me see if I can address that. And questions or discussion area, feel free to come off mute and ask things. Yeah, specific questions about our co-op. You can hit me up at clinic@usworker.coop, or if you're ready to have an intake call, right? If you have a project, we're happy to do that and find some specific resources for you, but feel free to email me with specific questions. Or if you have something here that might be relevant to others, feel free to bring it up. Yeah, so yeah, feel free to dive in with any questions. I'm happy to go in any more, in the worker self-directed, or just working with a nonprofit arena, or more on the legal side, or anywhere you'd like to go. The multi-stakeholder, and love talking about multi-stakeholder. Yeah, go ahead, Kendra.
Hey, Matt. So I had a question about the founders' compensation and just kind of the founders' stuff, right? So I'm a founder. I have two other folks who are involved in the work thus far. They haven't committed to being part of a co-op for the long term. We're still just getting the business up off the ground. We're not actually bringing in enough revenue to support like two other full-time staff or anything. So, we're a consultancy. But I want to, I can't do all the founding stuff for myself. So I definitely want more hands to help with business development, to be building the work. I want to compensate people for their time, but I'm not currently earning enough revenue that I can do all of that right now. Plus, I've already, I put in hundreds of hours as well. So it wouldn't really seem fair to just start paying other people off the bat for their business development time when I'm not paying myself for that. But again, I'm thinking about equity. I'm thinking about long-term. I'm thinking about our short-term, just where we are, what we're capable of right now in terms of revenue. I wonder if you can just share any snippets of kind of founders' compensation, and then also maybe some other compensation structures for other type of consulting type cooperatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a peer advisor from Wholehearted Bookkeeping Cooperative that's figured a lot of these things out for their co-op. Cool. That is a bookkeeping and consulting kind of co-op, and they have a great training called How to Pay Ourselves. And so they, are member owners, but have to figure out, the expected income of gig work or, consulting work. And
yeah.
And then so they have kind of this flowing spreadsheet of, their compensation rates, what's kind of a baseline, and then additional compensation they can add on a quarterly basis, or so there's some great models there that they share on a recorded training there on Wholehearted Bookkeeping. I think it's linked in the resource document too. But yeah, in terms of founders, often in startups, you're like, hey, come and work for us for way under what you'd get paid at another, company, but you get some equity shares that and someday in the future are going to be worth tons, right? That's how it's done in a traditional company, not so much in a co-op. There are some ways to figure out some of that kind of thing into your startup model, and Jason Weiner Associates, offers some great legal services around that. But more commonly, you come up with an agreement with your founding team really early on, like all this sweat equity that you're putting in is going to be compensated eventually, or a good portion of it will be eventually compensated when there's profits, right? Before profit sharing happens, there'll be founders compensation that happens. Or there's, longevity and founders kind of built into the compensation model too, where people who have been there a certain number of years have a higher compensation, structure built in until there's some leveling, or, so what is important is that you're doing some sort of tracking of it or estimation of what you've put in, and some sort of agreement around how that might be compensated, as you start to generate revenue, or in the future when there's surplus generated, and what you think you can afford and what is fair, so that people coming in really can say, okay, yeah, I'm buying in and I'm getting a little less compensation, but all of this value has been created, and I know I'm buying into that too, and making sure that there's some compensation, because otherwise there's always kind of this power dynamic of the founders put in all this and you can never go against what they say, and that creates a tough dynamic. But you also deserve some sort of compensation for your added risk and additional investments that you're doing of time and maybe money or connections, or client relationships, or whatever you're bringing should be valued somehow, and or just recognized too. Public recognition of that is a good thing to have an agreement around. So yeah, we have a guide that can walk through some more specifics. Some people use this tool called Slicing Pie as a way of tracking those startup expenses. What else can I share? Yeah, it might not be just an hourly, like we're valued at 50 an hour in consulting, we're going to get that compensation, but it might be something that's more of a long-term, like when there's an upside, there'll be more contributed to the people who did initial founders work.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. That's really helpful. What is the slice of pie thing? Is that a model, or is that a website or a tool?
It's like an app, and yeah, I think it's linked in the links document, resource document. It's Slicing Pie. Yeah, it's just a tool that startups use to track a lot of that. The link to the bookkeeper, yeah, Wholehearted Bookkeeping. Let me find their website and share it with you. Yeah, because they have a great training on their website. You can buy or consult with them. There, it's wholeheartedbookkeeping.com.
Oh, I think I found them. Awesome.
Yeah, any other questions or suggestions or resources people want to share?
I'm just a little bit curious. This is Emily. I have COSAP Co-op, the apparel company. We are doing multi-stakeholder cooperative, but just a little bit curious on your take for the worker portion of the cooperative. I know we went through the principles, and the one was like open and voluntary. Do you find, is it a thing with like power dynamics, or how does that work if like workers have an option to whether be in or out of the co-op, and how that like can like maybe create some friction between workers if not everyone is required to be in it after a certain vesting period?
Yeah, what's important to fulfill that principle is that there is a fair way to become a member. But some co-ops decide to make it mandatory, just because they want to avoid that dynamic you're talking about, right? A year has passed. A worker needs to decide whether they're a member or they need to move on and find another company that better fits them. But it's really up to you. Lots of co-ops make it optional. But the key part there is to make your member benefits ones that are appealing, right? In the additional work and meetings that it might be to be a member should be worth it, right? Whether it's not just potentially financially worth it, but in terms of a say in your workplace that is meaningful, right? And practicing that, having meaningful places for people to engage even before they're members to see what that democracy looks like and that it's effective has been some of the key components. Like, yeah, I've worked with some brewery co-ops that, have such a fast-paced, restaurant kind of vibe where it's like, okay, building that, making that appealing to on top of all the rushing, work that you do, to also want to go to an additional meeting. Like, how do you make that meaningful and to have some mutual support mechanisms too? Like people are really building relationships and finding support with each other. So in terms of a the worker component of a multi-stakeholder co-op. Yeah, I don't know if there's a one size fits all thing that could be said for that, but usually, to be well represented, that there's issues that are coming up regularly at the board meetings or the representative meetings that are taking into account topics that affect workers, and that if you want to have it optional, that it's okay. People who want to opt in and be more involved in the governance components do so. And that, yeah, but I don't know if there's a foolproof mechanism to prevent any resentment that might come up around that. But, make sure you're showing and demonstrating the value that membership offers, I'd say, especially in the having a say. Like, those kind of meaningful committees that you can be on or meaningful decisions that you make as a member, in addition to being really clear about the patronage, right? The profit share. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then also, just as we're like kind of thinking through like the bylaws and all the membership details, thinking on whether you have to be full-time versus part-time to become a member, and then like kind of trying to think through, does the pricing structure look the same for full-time versus part-time, and how that, divvies out with the dividends and everything like that. Is in your experience, are most worker members all like full-time, or I don't, if you can speak a little bit to that.
That varies quite a bit, but there's usually some sort of minimum threshold that is set pretty early on, and that can change later, not arbitrarily to exclude a member, but it can change if you found you need a higher threshold or a lower threshold to include more people. But there's usually some 20 hours a week, or if it's not a regular weekly thing, a certain number of hours have been worked in a 6-month period or something to meet the minimum requirements of membership. And that is key, that you've agreed on that number and that it's sufficient. It depends on the industry. And usually it's like how much interaction is happening, right? Do you know if that member is a good fit to be a full member, if that individual is a good fit to be a full member? If you're very remote, 10 hours a week for 6 months might not be enough. But if you're interacting constantly in a physical workplace, that might be sufficient. So it depends a little bit, but that's usually the factor, right? Is how much are you interacting? How much are you understanding? Like how many leadership roles are there for this person to show that they're a good fit, that they get the mission, vision, values, that they can incorporate that they're not going to be problematic in different ways or do harm to the co-op. So yeah, set that level. And I really discourage a tiered membership based on hours worked per week, that it's much more effective to have one membership fee, right? And usually a one-time fee. It depends, but usually a one-time fee, and then there can be additional payments in for other benefits, or there can be additional equity, invested in the co-op. There can be ways of paying it over time to make it accessible. But I would discourage, oh, this is a part-time membership and $200, and this is a full-time membership and it's $400, because at the end of the day, it's one member, one vote, right? So you try to avoid that stratification. But what is the minimum that should be required to have eligible to be a full member? And again, it's usually more about the democracy than the profit sharing, but it is both.
Great, thank you. Sorry, one more thing off of that though is as we're kind of like getting set up and it's such early days, and me and Alex, who's also on the call, are the first worker members as the co-founders. When we're not technically full-time employees yet, but we are, the original worker members, like how do we build out the bylaws? Do we wait to kind of fill that worker portion out to when, just how do we kind of set those guidelines when we're not able to be the full-time workers yet?
Yeah. It's always the trick, right? Setting something in a lasting policy document like your bylaws, that will be good for when you grow to 10 worker owners, right? But is also working for your team as two. And that's a tricky thing to lace. You can always change those documents, but it's common for people to not come back to those and to, so ideally you're doing something that does fulfill, like, okay, 20 hours a week is what we have, and it does meet our requirements. Let's set that into place, even if there are two worker members at this point. It will grow. And then a majority of those are the ones who elect the worker member seat on the board. Okay, that works for 2, and it'll work for 10. If it's a simple majority, oh, maybe a 2/3 majority works better. Set those kind of policies and think about both scenarios or multiple scenarios as you do it. And I would encourage you to, set it in place as early as possible, even if you can't fully, fill in, and just allow for some flexibility language in there that's like, when these are met, or when there are sufficient workers to fulfill whatever, then this comes into play. So yeah, those are some ideas.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. Hope you'll get a follow-up email. Oh, and here is the I'm going to put in the chat real quick the evaluation link. If you would please do a quick evaluation of this webinar, and we will send other resources in a follow-up email as well. 1 second for that link. Here it is. So thank you all for joining, and look forward to talking to more of you in the future.
Thanks,
Okay.
Matt.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.